I was finishing my coffee when the phone rang, at a time too strange to be a coincidence. The voice on the other end was polite, neutral, professional. They said my full name, confirmed my ID number, and without hesitation informed them of an scheduled psychiatric evaluation. I was silent, trying to understand if I had heard correctly. My heart started beating faster. I never scheduled any exam. I asked who had requested that, and the attendant replied as if it were obvious. He said that the request had come from a direct family member, someone concerned about my mental state. I felt the ground disappear for a moment. My hands trembled as I held the phone. The word mental echoed in my head like a broken bell. I thanked him mechanically and hung up. I sat at the table, staring at the still hot cup, trying to collect my thoughts. I remembered everything: what I had eaten the day before, the conversation with the neighbor, the check I had to pay. Nothing in me felt broken. Even so, someone was telling the world that I was no longer capable. For the first time, I felt afraid that I wasn't enough. I got up slowly and walked around the house, touching the furniture as if confirming its own existence. Each photograph on the wall had a clear story in my mind. My husband smiling, my small children, birthdays that I remembered in detail. That wasn't the mind of someone lost. It was someone's mind being pushed into the dark, and I began to suspect who was holding the flashlight. The phone rang again, and this time I already knew who it was before I even answered. My daughter spoke in a tone that was too sweet, too rehearsed. He said he was going to visit me, that he needed to talk calmly. When he mentioned my health, I felt a knot in my stomach. There was something decided without me. Something in progress. While I waited, I started to go over old conversations, small comments that I had previously ignored. The times she corrected my memory unnecessarily. The glances exchanged when I entered the room. Everything seemed harmless before, but now I gained another weight. I wasn't forgetting things. I was being erased little by little. I sat on the couch and took a deep breath, trying not to cry. I never thought I would have to defend myself because I was lucid. I spent my whole life taking care of others, making difficult decisions, being strong when no one saw. Now, at 68, someone had decided that I was a problem, that I needed to be controlled. And that hurt more than any diagnosis. When I heard the noise of the car parking, my whole body tensed. I still didn't know exactly what was happening, but I knew it wasn't out of love. There was too much haste, too much organization, too much security in her attitudes. Those who really care do not schedule hidden exams. Who loves, talks. At that moment, something changed inside me. The fear was still there, but it wasn't alone. A strange, almost cold clarity came along. If they wanted to prove me incapable, I would have to prove otherwise. Not for them, but for me. I needed to understand how far this went. The doorbell rang, marking the end of my former tranquility. Before I got up to open the door, I promised myself one thing. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. If they were trying to rewrite my story, I would make sure to remember every line. The fact that you are here, listening to this story so far, already shows that you pay attention to what many people prefer to ignore. What comes next isn't just about my life, it's about memory, dignity, and no one's right to decide who you are. If you believe that stories like this need to keep being told, subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because this isn't just about me, it's about all of us. She entered the house as if she still owned that space, looking around with a mixture of evaluation and impatience. He brought a ready smile on his face, one of those that don't reach the eyes, and hugged me quickly, almost out of obligation. He said I looked tired, before he even asked how I was. That hit me more than any direct accusation. There was already a diagnosis in her head. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I helped her with homework so many years ago. Now she was the one who spoke slowly, as if explaining something difficult to a child. She said she was worried about me, that I had been confusing things. Each word was carefully chosen to sound like care, but it carried control. When I mentioned the call from the health plan, she didn't seem surprised. He just sighed, as if he were tired of repeating the obvious. He said he had taken the initiative because he loved me, because someone needed to act. Hearing that made my stomach turn. She didn't ask if I agreed. She decided. I tried to argue, to say that I was fine, that I remembered everything. I told details of my previous day, names, dates, appointments. She interrupted me with forced delicacy, saying that people, in my condition, often deny symptoms. It was at that moment that I realized the size of the trap. Any defense of mine became evidence against me. I observed his gestures, the way he looked away when I insisted. There was something rehearsed there, a security that did not come from love, but from the certainty of those who had already taken the next steps. She talked about doctors, processes, the future, as if I were already out of the equation. I asked if my grandchildren knew all this. She replied that she did not want to confuse them, that it was better to spare them. That hurt more than anything else. They were taking me away from my own family in the name of a protection that I never asked for. As she spoke, I began to feel something different grow inside me. It wasn't anger, yet. It was attention. I started to listen less to the tone and more to the content, putting pieces together. To realize how much she avoided certain subjects, how much she changed the subject when I mentioned documents or the house. When I finally said that maybe I should think about living with her, I felt a chill run down my spine. That was not taken care of. It was displacement. It was removed from territory. My home, my routine, my autonomy, everything seemed negotiable, except her version of the facts. I pretended to agree, lowered my eyes, let her believe in the role she had created for me. I saw a quick relief come up on his face. She thought she had won. Little did I know that, in that silence, I was beginning to understand the game. When she left, the house was quieter than ever. But for the first time since the call, I didn't feel weak. Something had awakened in me. If it was to prove that I was lucid, I would do it calmly. And if there was something hidden behind all that, I was going to find it. I was alone in the living room for a few minutes, listening only to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. That sound always calmed me down, but that day seemed to mark something else, the time I still had before they decided everything for me. I took a deep breath and stood up slowly, as if the house was watching me. It was there that my story was kept. I ran my hand over the back of the sofa, remembering when I bought it with my husband, after years of saving. I remembered the silly discussion about color, the laughter in the late afternoon, the smell of new paint. These memories came clear, whole, without flaws. No one with a confused mind keeps details like that. That gave me a strange sense of strength. I walked to the corridor where the old photos are. Each of them had a chapter of my life. The birth of my children, simple parties, lazy Sundays. I stayed there for a few minutes, not out of nostalgia, but out of confirmation. I knew exactly who I was. And that was something that no one could take away from me with words or commissioned reports. I entered the room and opened the wardrobe, looking for an old folder where I kept important documents. He was not in the usual place. My heart raced. I started rummaging through drawers, shelves, boxes. Some things were out of place, others were simply gone. That was not my forgetfulness. Someone had moved there. I sat on the bed trying to stay calm. I thought about all the times my daughter had been alone in the house in the last few months, saying she came to help. At the time, I thought it was beautiful. Now, each visit took on another meaning. A different weight. The feeling of invasion began to tighten my chest. I got up again and went to the small office where I kept my husband's old papers. I opened the drawer carefully and found torn envelopes, incomplete documents. There were gaps there. Too much white space to be a fluke. For the first time, I felt that it was beyond my health. There was interest. There was something to be hidden. I leaned against the table and closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't cry. Instead, I began to think clearly. If someone was trying to get me out of the way, there had to be a strong reason. And reasons like this almost always leave traces. Papers, money, poorly explained decisions. I took an old notebook and started writing down everything that seemed out of place. Dates, names, small attitudes. Not to prove anything to anyone yet, but to organize my own thoughts. That brought me an unexpected sense of control. As if, little by little, I was taking back something that they tried to steal from me. When I finished, I looked around the house once more. That wasn't just my home. It was my territory, my living history. And no one was going to pull me out of there without a fight. Not after all that I had lived within those walls. That night, I went to bed knowing that something had changed. I didn't have all the answers, but I had a firm certainty. My memory was intact. And precisely for this reason, I needed to find out the truth before it was too late. I arrived at the clinic feeling that butterflies in my stomach that did not come from fear of the result, but from silent humiliation. People passed me by without knowing that I was there to prove that I still owned my own head. The receptionist smiled, asked for my documents and confirmed my name as if it were just another common procedure. For me, it wasn't common. It was a trial. My daughter sat next to me in the waiting room, crossing her legs impatiently. She said I looked nervous and asked if I remembered why we were there. That question was like a slap disguised as care. I took a deep breath and answered calmly, saying the name of the doctor, the type of exam and even the scheduled time. She did not answer. He just looked away. When I was called, I entered the office alone. The doctor greeted me with respect, something I hadn't felt for days. It started with simple questions, then moved on to more complex tests. He asked me to remember lists, stories, dates. I did everything with tranquility. My mind worked clear, sharp, attentive. That brought me a quiet peace. As he answered, he watched the doctor's face change. There was no concern there, just professional curiosity. He took notes, took new tests, and the further we went, the safer he seemed. At no time did I feel that I was being treated as incapable. For the first time since the beginning of everything, I felt seen. In the end, he said that the preliminary results were excellent. He used words like cognitive preservation and mindfulness. My chest filled with air, as if I had not breathed for days. I thanked him, but I knew that that battle was not yet won. When I left the office, I found my daughter leaning against the wall, playing with her cell phone. When I told her what the doctor said, she frowned. He didn't smile, he didn't show relief. He only commented that initial tests do not always say everything. That confirmed what I already felt. She didn't want me to be well. We went back to the waiting room to schedule new procedures. While the attendant spoke, my daughter interrupted, asking for more evaluations, more opinions. I watched in silence, memorizing every gesture, every word. There was too much haste in her. And where there is a hurry, there is almost always fear of being discovered. On the way back, she said little. He said that all that was tiring, that maybe I wouldn't even remember later. I looked out the window, feeling something harden inside me. It wasn't anger yet. It was determination. I didn't need to convince her. I needed to protect myself. When I got home, I sat at the table and wrote down everything: the doctor's name, what was said, her reactions. Not out of paranoia, but out of strategy. If they wanted to erase me, I would do the opposite. I would record everything. That night, I slept less than I would have liked, but with a new certainty. Science was on my side. And if my daughter insisted on painting me as lost, it was because the truth, intact in my memory, was exactly what threatened her the most. In the days that followed, something invisible began to close in around me, as if the world was getting smaller without my permission. The phone, which used to ring with some frequency, started to remain silent for hours. When I finally played, it was almost always my daughter. That was no coincidence. It was silent control. I realized that my grandchildren had disappeared from my routine. Spontaneous visits ceased, messages became rare. When I called one of them, I heard on the other end that the mother had said that I was too confused to talk. I didn't answer for a few seconds, feeling a deep pain in my chest. They were using my supposed state against me. At the neighborhood market, I noticed subtle changes. People looked at me with excessive care, spoke to me too slowly. A neighbor commented that my daughter was being very responsible in taking care of everything. I smiled on the outside, but inside I felt a shame that didn't belong to me. They were talking about me as if I wasn't there. At home, I began to notice disturbing details. Open mail, bills paid without me remembering having authorized it, papers out of place. When I questioned, my daughter answered naturally, saying that she was just organizing. There was no request, no explanation. Only decisions made on my behalf. I started to feel that my every move was watched. Every word, evaluated. If I disagreed, it was stubbornness. If he insisted, it was confusion. If I kept silent, it was a sign of weakness. There was no comfortable way out. Everything seemed to confirm a narrative that I had not created. One afternoon, I tried to visit an old friend, someone who had known me for decades. I found out, when I got there, that my daughter had called before, asking her not to receive me, claiming that I needed to rest. I returned home with a lump in my throat that was difficult to undo. They were taking me away from my own witnesses. It was during this period that I began to be afraid of talking too much. Fear that any sentence crossed would be used later as proof of instability. So I started to listen more than react. To be watched carefully, keeping expressions, phrases, contradictions. If they wanted to paint me as lost, I needed to be even more precise. On a silent night, I sat alone in the living room and cried. Not of despair, but of mourning. I fight for the woman I always was and who they were now trying to erase. I let the tears fall unhurriedly, as if saying goodbye to an old illusion. After the crying, something changed. I felt a new, almost comforting coldness. If they were isolating me, it was because I posed a threat to their plans. No one silences someone who doesn't know anything. That, strangely, gave me strength. I then started to write everything down more rigorously. Dates, calls, people away, decisions made without me. Each note was an anchor. A proof that my mind was steady. They were trying to leave me alone. But I already understood, as long as I could think clearly, I would never be defenseless. I returned to the clinic a few days later, but I didn't go there in the same way. There was a constant, almost vigilant attention in me, as if every detail could reveal something important. I sat in the waiting room while my daughter filled out forms for me, answering questions that no one had asked her. That bothered me, but I was silent, watching. When my name was called, the doctor appeared at the door and pronounced my last name firmly. His gaze came straight at me. He didn't pass my daughter before. This simple detail made an unexpected impact on me. It had been a long time since anyone recognized me as the central person of their own story. Inside the office, the doctor asked me to sit facing her. My daughter tried to pull the chair closer, as if it was natural to occupy that space. The doctor, polite but firm, asked her to wait further away. It was a small gesture, but enough to change the mood of the room. The test started quietly. Simple questions, then more elaborate. Recent memory, old memory, association of ideas, logic. I responded calmly, unhurriedly, feeling a strange satisfaction in perceiving my mind working clearly. Each correct answer was a silent affirmation of who I still was. Meanwhile, I noticed that the doctor was not just watching me. I wrote down the timing of my daughter's answers, her interruptions, the impatient looks, the attempts to correct something I hadn't even made a mistake. It was as if she was evaluating two people at the same time, even without saying it out loud. At one point, the doctor closed the clipboard and said she would like to talk to me alone. My daughter reacted immediately, saying that I was nervous without company. The doctor did not raise her voice, did not argue. He only stated that this was a professional request. My daughter, upset, left. When the door closed, silence took over the office. The doctor took a deep breath before speaking. He said that my tests were consistent, that there were no signs of cognitive impairment, nor mental confusion. That brought me relief, but it was what came after that really shook me. She asked, carefully, if anyone was trying to control my decisions or keep me away from people close to me. It was not a generic question. It was direct, precise. I felt a lump form in my throat. For a few seconds, I thought about denying, minimizing. But something in her eyes made me trust. I told him about the appointments scheduled without my consent, about the open correspondence, about the people who were away. I spoke of the constant feeling of being watched, corrected, diminished. The doctor listened to everything without interrupting, writing down only at the end, as if she already recognized that pattern. She explained to me that it had a name, that it was not careful, nor exaggerated zeal. He talked about psychological manipulation, about emotional abuse disguised as worry. I said that, unfortunately, this happened more than people imagine, especially with women my age. Before I left, she wrote a name on a piece of paper and folded it carefully. I said I was someone who could guide me better, someone who dealt with situations in which family and interest mix. He asked me to keep that paper and not to comment to anyone yet. As I left the office, I found my daughter waiting for me with a tense expression. She asked what we had talked about. I only replied that everything was fine. For the first time, I didn't feel like explaining. For the first time, I felt like I had a quiet advantage. That day, when I returned home, I realized that something had changed definitively. I was no longer just a woman trying to prove I wasn't lost. I was someone who was beginning to understand the game. And, more importantly, someone who was no longer playing alone. I returned home with the feeling that each wall now held more than memories. There were secrets there, and I began to see them in the small absences. As soon as I closed the door, I went straight to the bedroom, without taking off my coat. Something inside me said that I needed to look while I still had time. I opened the wardrobe again and pulled out the box where I had always kept important documents. It was lighter. Papers that I had known for years were not there. Old contracts, statements kept just in case, envelopes with my husband's notes. Everything seemed to have been rearranged by someone who knew exactly what to look for. I sat on the bed with the remaining papers scattered around me. It wasn't a mess. It was a national team. Someone had removed only what could cause problems. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that it required time, calm, and intention. It was not done in a hurry. It was planned. I began to mentally retrace my daughter's last visits. The times she asked to use the bathroom and it took too long. The moments when she was alone in the room while I prepared coffee. Everything that once seemed normal now took on an unsettling contour. I went to the small office and opened the desk drawer. I found torn envelopes, incomplete documents, and notes that were not mine. There were underlined numbers, circled dates, as if someone were putting together a map. That confirmed what I feared. It wasn't just about me. It was about money. Among the papers, I found an old receipt that my daughter probably hadn't considered important. I recognized my husband's signature immediately. The date, however, did not make sense. It was from a period when he said he was unemployed. My heart raced. I sat down again, holding that paper as if it were something alive. That small detail opened a door to a past that I had never questioned. My husband has always been reserved, but I never thought I could have hidden something so big. And if he hid it, someone knew. I began to organize everything into piles: what was missing, what was left, what seemed out of place. I wrote down dates, values, names. Each new piece of information was like a piece of an old puzzle that someone hastily tried to disassemble before I saw it complete. As I did so, I felt a mixture of pain and clarity. It wasn't just my daughter's betrayal that began to appear. It was that of an entire marriage that perhaps had not been as transparent as I believed. That hurt, but it also freed me from a belated naivety. When I finished, I kept everything in a new folder and hid it in a place that only I knew. For the first time, I felt like I was a few steps ahead. If they were trying to confuse me, they had failed. My memory didn't just work. She was about to reveal things that no one wanted to remember. I spent almost the entire night awake, sitting at the kitchen table, with the documents scattered before me like cards from an old game. The house was silent, but my head didn't stop. Each date seemed to talk to another, each number pulled a memory that I had preferred to ignore for years. It wasn't confusion. It was fitting. When the day dawned, I made a decision that I never thought I would make on my own. I took the oldest receipt and went to the indicated bank, without telling anyone. On the way, my hands sweated and my heart pounded, not from fear of what I might find, but from the certainty that something there would change everything. Some truths only hurt because they come too late. In the service, I was direct. I showed the document, confirmed names, dates, authorizations. The attendant took longer than usual and came back with a look too serious to be neutral. It confirmed the existence of an old account, active for years, linked to my husband's name. He also said that there was another person associated. A name that was not mine. I left the seat feeling the heavy air, as if I had aged 10 years in a few minutes. I sat on a bench in the nearby square and watched people go by, going about their routines without knowing that my world had just cracked. Gradually, forgotten memories began to reorganize themselves inside me. Trips that he said were for work, poorly explained absences, interrupted phone calls when I entered the room. I remembered a woman who showed up at a distant funeral years ago and whom my daughter treated with strange intimacy. At the time, I swallowed the uncomfortable feeling and moved on. Now, it all made sense. The hardest blow was not discovering my husband's betrayal. It was understanding that my daughter always knew. She not only accepted that truth, but helped protect it. The current manipulation was not a sudden outbreak of care. It was a continuation of an old agreement, built behind my back. I returned home with my body tired, but my mind functioning as never before. I didn't cry at that moment. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a silent pain, which settles in and changes the way you see your whole story. I had lived inside an edited version of my life. I opened the folders again and joined the new information to the old ones. Now there was a clear line connecting everything. The attempt to interdict me, the missing documents, the forced examinations. It wasn't about my memory. It was about preventing me from having access to what has always been rightfully mine. I picked up the phone and almost called my daughter, but I stopped. Confronting without preparation would be exactly the mistake they expected of me. They counted on my emotional reaction, on my lack of control. What they didn't expect was that I was more lucid than ever. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling in the dark and accepted something difficult. My life had not been a whole lie, but neither had it been the complete truth. And now, that I finally saw everything, I couldn't pretend I didn't see it. I fell asleep with a firm, almost cold certainty. They tried to convince me that I was losing my memory. Little did they know that in doing so, they awakened the very thing they feared most, the woman who remembers everything. I found out what my daughter was doing on an apparently ordinary afternoon, one of those in which the silence of the house weighs more than it should. I opened the mail before it arrived, something I started to do out of survival instinct. Between bills and ads, there was a thicker envelope, with legal terms too much to ignore. My name appeared there accompanied by cold, calculated words that spoke of disability and legal protection. I felt my blood run cold. I sat slowly at the table, rereading each line carefully. It was not a consultation, nor an informal notice. It was a process. A formal request for interdiction already in progress, filed by my own daughter. She claimed that I was no longer able to manage my life, my finances, my house. All that without ever having talked to me honestly. Without my consent. Without my right to choose. What scared me the most was not the betrayal itself, but the level of planning. There were references to exams, doctors, witnesses, ready-made arguments. Everything was very well organized, as if it had been thought of for months. Every step she took with me in recent times now made sense. Nothing was impulsive. Everything was calculated. I began to connect the dots with painful clarity. The isolation, the grandchildren away, the people warned that I was confused, the documents missing. It was all part of the same strategy. To build an image of myself that would justify, before the law, the withdrawal of my autonomy. He was not careful. It was a substitution. The fear came strong, heavy, real. The thought of losing my home, of being forced to live elsewhere, of no longer having control over my own life made me tremble. It was no longer just an emotional dispute between mother and daughter. It was a direct threat to my freedom, to my dignity, to my existence as a capable person. For a few minutes, I thought about confronting her immediately. Shouting, demanding explanations, throwing the papers on the table. But I soon understood that this would be exactly what she expected. An emotional reaction, a lack of control, anything that reinforced the narrative that I was not well. I needed to be smarter than impulsive. It was then that I remembered the folded paper that the doctor had handed me. The name was still there, kept as a precious secret. At that moment, I understood how careful this woman had been. She had already seen situations like mine. She knew where it could go. And he had given me a way out. I organized all the documents even more carefully. I separated exams, notes, isolation tests, records of decisions made without me. Each leaf was a defense. Every detail was an anchor in reality. They had a solid plan. But now I had mine too, and it wasn't based on lies. When my daughter arrived that night, she talked about trivial things, as if nothing was happening. She asked if I had eaten, if I was tired. I answered little. I observed a lot. For the first time, I felt that she was not as safe as she pretended. Maybe he had noticed something different in me. A silent change. Lying in bed, it took me a long time to sleep. Not only out of fear, but because of the dimension of what was at stake. They tried to convince me that I was losing my memory. What they did not realize is that, in doing so, they awakened in me an implacable lucidity. They could try to interdict me on paper. But my mind was more awake than ever, and I wasn't going to give my life without a fight. The next day, I woke up with strange, almost uncomfortable clarity. There was no more room for doubt or postponement. I took the paper that the doctor had handed me and dialed the number with a firm hand, despite my racing heart. When the voice on the other end answered, I introduced myself calmly and said only that I needed help so as not to lose my autonomy. He scheduled the meeting for that same week. I arrived at the office feeling the weight of the situation on my shoulders, but also a determination that I didn't know in myself. The lawyer received me without haste, asked me to tell everything from the beginning. He didn't interrupt me once. For the first time in months, I spoke without being corrected, without being questioned, without feeling that I needed to prove who I was. While I was reporting on the exams, the isolation, the missing documents and the request for interdiction, I saw his face close. Not of surprise, but of recognition. That scared me more than any overreaction. It meant that my story was not unique, that there was a pattern, and that I wasn't imagining anything. He went straight to the point. He said that what they were doing to me had a name: psychological abuse and an attempt to control assets. He explained that the interdiction, when used in this way, was a dangerous weapon. And he added, looking into my eyes, that I was still in time to turn the tide. I took out of my bag the folder with all the documents I had been gathering. Medical exams, notes, old receipts, call logs, and decisions made without me. He analyzed everything carefully, asking specific questions, connecting information that I had not yet been able to fully organize. With each comment, I felt fear give way to firmness. The lawyer explained the next steps clearly. He spoke of hearings, independent expertise, witnesses. He said that patience and cool-bloodedness would be necessary. It would not be quick or easy, but it was possible. And more importantly, it was fair. That word echoed inside me like something forgotten. When he suggested that I continue to feign frailty for the time being, I felt immediate discomfort. But I understood why. It was a strategy. Letting my daughter believe she was in control, while we carefully mounted the defense. It required strength of a different kind. I left the office with the feeling of carrying a powerful secret. For the first time, I didn't feel cornered. There was a plan. There was someone next to me who knew exactly what to do. And, above all, there was proof. The truth was no longer just in my head. When I got home, I found my daughter sitting in the living room, playing with her cell phone. He asked where I had gone. I answered vaguely, said I was tired. I watched her suspicious look, her attempt to read something in me. For the first time, I had something she couldn't touch. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how much I had changed in a short time. I still felt pain, there was still fear. But now they shared space with something new: strategy. I was no longer just a mother being betrayed. I was a woman defending her own existence. And he did not intend to back down. In the days that followed, I began to play the role that was expected of me with an almost painful precision. I started to repeat simple questions, to purposely confuse myself with schedules, to ask for help for things I always did alone. Every gesture was calculated, every mistake was staged. Inside, it hurt me, but I knew it was necessary. My daughter reacted exactly as I predicted. He became more confident, more sure of himself. He spoke to me with that patient tone that no longer hid his satisfaction. He corrected my sentences, completed my thoughts, made decisions without even consulting me. The more fragile I appeared, the more it revealed. I started to observe everything with extra attention. The calls she made in the hallway, the papers she hid too quickly when I walked into the room, the nervous smiles when I mentioned money or the house. Feigning weakness gave me access to truths that would never be told directly. I also began to record conversations discreetly, whenever possible. Not for revenge, but for protection. Each recorded word was an extra layer between me and the injustice they were trying to build. At night, I listened to everything by myself, confirming that my intuition never failed. There were times when I almost gave up on the staging. Especially when she talked about me to other people as if I wasn't already there, as if I was a child or a problem to be solved. He swallowed his pride, took a deep breath and moved on. I knew what was at stake. On a few occasions, she tested me. He asked questions about the past, about important dates, hoping that I would make a mistake. I made a mistake on purpose. I saw the immediate relief appear on his face. That hurt, but it also strengthened me. Each test she won was a test that would later turn against her. Inside, I was no longer the same. There was a clear division between what I showed and what I was. While on the outside it seemed confused, on the inside my mind worked with an almost implacable lucidity. I planned, anticipated, organized each next step. This next part is the hardest to put into words, because in telling it I relived choices that cost me relationships, silence, and peace. Opening this up here means accepting that not every wound closes when the truth comes out. If you've gotten to this point with me, it's because you understand that being silent hurts more than exposing. So I ask you, sign up, not as a support for me, but as a way to ensure that voices like mine continue to exist, even when they bother you. The lawyer advised me to stay calm and not rush anything. He said that this type of game requires patience, because those who believe they are in control often make mistakes. And my daughter started committing them. Small slips, excessive comments, too much confidence. One night, I heard her on the phone saying that, soon everything would be solved. That phrase echoed in me like a challenge. She believed that victory was inevitable. He had no idea that her every step was being carefully recorded. As I lay down that night, I felt the weight of the staging on my body, but also a new strength. Feigning fragility did not make me weak. On the contrary. It was proof that I was willing to go to the end to protect my life, my history, and my dignity. And the end was approaching. The confirmation of the hearing came in an almost cruel way, on a morning when I was feigning confusion when looking for the glasses that were perfectly in front of me. My daughter entered the house with an envelope in her hand and an air of false tranquility on her face. He said it was just a procedure, something simple, quick, done, for my good. I nodded slowly, as if I didn't fully understand, while inside every detail fit together precisely. She read the content aloud, slowly, exaggerating the explanations, as if she were talking to someone unable to follow an entire sentence. Date, time, place, difficult legal names. I made a point of repeating some information wrongly, confusing others, asking her to explain it again. I saw, in her eyes, that restrained sparkle of someone who believes that control is already guaranteed. As soon as I was alone, I called the lawyer. His reaction was serene, almost predictable. He said that this was the expected movement, that the attempt at interdiction now needed to justify itself in front of other people. He asked me to continue exactly as I was, not to break the character before the time. That required more strength than any direct confrontation. In the following days, my routine became a permanent theater. My daughter started to choose my clothes, organize my schedules, even decide what I would eat. He spoke to me as someone who manages a logistical problem. In every gesture, there was too much haste. And I knew, those who are in a hurry, fear losing something. At night, alone in the room, I mentally reviewed everything that had been gathered. Clear medical examinations, old documents, records of manipulation, recordings, detailed notes. Every piece of evidence was stored out of her reach, protected as if it were part of my own body. That brought me a hard, almost cold calm. There were times when fatigue almost made me give up on the staging. Feigning fragility corrodes from within. Hearing someone talk about you as if you weren't there hurts in a silent way. But I remembered what was at stake: my home, my autonomy, my entire history. On the eve of the hearing, my daughter could no longer hide her anxiety. She walked around the house with her cell phone in her hand, making quick calls, talking quietly, smiling to herself. He said, more than once, that everything would be resolved soon, that I didn't have to worry. That sounded less like comfort and more like farewell. That night, I slept little. Not for fear of judgment, but for the awareness that nothing would ever be the same again. The truth, when finally spoken, cannot be collected. I was about to expose not only an attempt at interdiction, but a betrayal built over years. The next morning, I dressed carefully. I chose simple, discreet clothes, exactly as they expected of me. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw two reflected versions. The woman they pretended to control, and the woman who knew exactly what she was about to do. When I left the house and got in the car, I took a deep breath. Every step up to that point had been calculated, endured, recorded. That wasn't just an audience. It was the moment when my voice, treated as a failure, would finally have space. And I was ready to remind everyone that I was never lost, just surrounded by lies. The hearing room seemed smaller than I had imagined, but the weight it carried was suffocating. The walls were clear, the air conditioning was too cold, the silence was full of expectation. I sat in the indicated chair keeping my shoulders slightly hunched, my gaze down, exactly as they expected of me. My daughter stood a few steps forward, posture upright, a folder organized in her hands. She didn't look at me at any time. It was not contempt. It was conviction. When the referee entered, I felt an immediate change in the air. It was not fear that I felt, but a deep, almost cutting attention. My lawyer sat next to me discreetly, without touching me, without exchanging words. His presence was solid, silent, and that anchored me. I continued to represent the fragile woman, breathing slowly, as if she were out of place in that environment. My daughter was the first to speak. He used a trained, technical tone, carefully packaged as concern. He spoke of my age, cited vague episodes of forgetfulness, mentioned incoherent attitudes without ever going into details. Each sentence seemed built to sound responsible, mature, necessary. At one point, he said that it was all out of love. Hearing that word in that context was like feeling a clean cut, without anesthesia. While she spoke, I observed everything. The excessive adjectives, the rush to conclude, the way he avoided specific dates and concrete facts. There was more emotion in the staging than truth in the content. When he finished, the silence that followed was brief but heavy. Then the judge asked my lawyer to speak out. He stood up calmly, as if he knew exactly the ground he was treading on. It started with the medical exams, one by one. He read the results aloud, citing dates, signatures, clear and conclusive reports. Every word sounded firm. With each exam presented, I noticed my daughter moving in the chair, crossing and uncrossing her hands, losing the initial rigidity. Then came the isolation records. Appointments scheduled without my consent, decisions made on my behalf, open correspondence, attempts to distance friends and family. Everything documented, everything chronological. There was no room for emotional interpretations. They were facts. When he presented the old documents, I felt the atmosphere change for good. He spoke of hidden accounts, undeclared assets, financial ties that never passed through me. He did not mention unnecessary names, but made it clear that there were patrimonial interests directly linked to the interdiction attempt. It was at that moment that I saw my daughter lose control for a second. A look too fast, a breath hold. I saw it. And I knew that everyone there saw it too. Then the judge turned to me. He asked, in a neutral voice, if I wished to say something. I raised my face slowly. I straightened my spine. The frail woman sat in that chair, but it was someone else who spoke. I said my full name, my age, I told my routine clearly. I spoke unhurriedly, looking into the eyes of those who listened to me. I said I wasn't there to punish my daughter, but to exist. I told him that I never lost my memory, I was just silenced. I explained that feigning fragility was the only way I could protect myself while gathering evidence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. Every word was placed in the right place, with precision. The silence that followed was stronger than any reaction. The judge asked for a few minutes to analyze the final documents. My daughter couldn't look at me anymore. The absolute certainty that she brought to that room had been transformed into an exhibition. When the decision was announced, I felt something heavy come off my shoulders. The request for interdiction was denied. My autonomy was reaffirmed. It was determined to open an investigation into psychological and patrimonial abuse. There were no screams, no public tears. Only the truth occupying the space that has always been hers. As I left the room, I walked with firm steps. There was still pain in me, yes. But above it was something bigger, more solid. Respect. At that moment, I understood that the confrontation had not only been legal. It was the exact moment when my voice, treated as a failure for so long, was finally heard. I left the courtroom with a light body and an eerily silent mind, as if the noise of the past few months had been turned off at once. In the corridor, I felt curious looks, some sympathetic, others just embarrassed. My daughter was walking a few steps behind me now, without the firm posture of before. Security had stayed in that room, scattered by the documents that denied it. She tried to talk to me when we got to the parking lot. I said my name in a low, almost childish tone, as if I could still pull myself back to the role I had created. I stopped, took a deep breath and stared at her. There was no anger in my eyes. There was something she no longer recognized, conscious distance. She began to justify herself, saying that everything got out of control, that she never wanted to hurt me. He spoke fast, running over words, as if trying to mend something that has already torn too much. I listened in silence. Not because he agreed, but because he no longer had to answer every lie. When I mentioned the hidden documents and the interdiction plan, she looked away. He said he did it out of fear, that he thought he was protecting me. It was there that the mask fell for good. Protection requires no secrecy. Caution does not need imposed silence. That was not love. It was convenience. I told her, in a calm voice, that I needed space. That the relationship between us had been crossed by something that could not be resolved with hasty apologies. I didn't scream, I didn't accuse her. I just set limits. And boundaries, I realized, were something she never expected to hear from me. Over the next few days, the house became strangely quiet. The phone rang less, but now by my choice. I organized documents, changed passwords, reorganized my routine. Every little decision I made myself was a silent confirmation of victory that wouldn't appear in photos or headlines. Some people tried to approach, curious, wanting details. I didn't. My story no longer needed to be explained to justify my sanity. Whoever needed to listen, listened. Whoever doubted it, lost the right to my intimacy. At night, sometimes, the pain still came. Not for the audience, but for the grief of the relationship I thought I had with my daughter. That doesn't disappear overnight. But, unlike before, the pain did not diminish me. She coexisted with something bigger, self-respect. I received a message from her a few days later, long, full of explanations. I read it carefully, but I didn't respond immediately. I learned that silence can also be a healthy choice. I needed to rebuild myself first, before deciding what would be left of the old ties. Over time, I realized that the biggest fall was not hers in front of justice. It was the fall of the image I had of myself as someone too fragile to face conflicts. This image was no longer sustainable. I had gone through the worst moment of my life without losing my clarity. In that period, I understood something essential. The mask that fell was not only hers. It was mine too. That of a submissive woman, who accepted to be silenced to keep the peace. That one is behind us. What is left is someone who knows his own worth, and does not accept less than that. The days that followed the confrontation were eerily silent, as if the world had turned down the volume so that I could finally hear myself. I woke up early, prepared my coffee calmly and sat at the table without haste. For the first time in a long time, no one decided anything for me. Every small gesture carried a huge symbolic weight. I was still in charge of my life. I began to reorganize the house, not out of practical necessity, but as a reconstruction ritual. I separated objects, donated clothes, moved furniture. Each rearranged corner seemed to say that this house was still mine, not only on paper, but in essence. It was as if I was marking territory again, not against someone, but in favor of myself. People gradually started calling again. Old friends, distant relatives, neighbors who had drifted apart because they heard distorted versions of my story. Some apologized, others just struck up a conversation as if nothing had happened. I carefully chose who deserved to be part of my daily life again. Rebuilding is also knowing how to choose. My daughter tried to contact me more than once. Long messages, full of explanations, mixing guilt and justifications. I read them all, carefully, without anger. But I didn't answer right away. I learned that I am not obliged to heal the wound of those who tried to hurt me. Some answers need time, and others simply don't need to exist. There were nights when loneliness tightened. Not physical loneliness, but emotional loneliness. The realization that the relationship I thought I had with my daughter would never be the same again. I cried in silence a few times, allowing myself to feel the guilt-free grief. Losing an illusion is also a form of real loss. At the same time, I began to discover a version of myself that had been dormant for years. I started to go out more, to make plans that I had never made alone. I enrolled in a simple course, something I always postponed because I thought it was no longer time. I discovered that time is not wasted while one is alive and conscious. The lawyer still called me occasionally to update me on legal developments, but that no longer consumed me. Justice had fulfilled its main role. The rest was a consequence. I had recovered something much more valuable than goods or documents, my autonomy. One afternoon, I sat in the backyard watching the sun slowly fall. I thought about everything that had happened and who I was before it all started. I realized that I didn't want to go back to being that woman. She survived as best she could, but now I was different. Tougher in some points, freer in others. When I finally answered my daughter, I was short and honest. I said that I needed distance, that maybe one day we could talk with maturity, but that now I chose myself. There was no immediate response. And, for the first time, it didn't shake me. Today, when someone asks how I am, I answer without hesitation. I'm whole. Not unscathed, not perfect, but whole. They tried to convince me that I was losing my memory, my reason, my value. In the end, they lost control over me. And that, I discovered, is the greatest victory anyone can have. If this story touched you in any way, please share this video. Not as an automatic gesture, but so that it reaches someone who may be experiencing something similar and still doesn't know how to name it. Often, these situations aren't isolated cases, they're silent patterns, and sharing that story can be the first step to breaking them.